Okay.
Well, let me begin on this cool morning in October to welcome all 10 of you and more who may join later to hear Dr. Allison Duff. She's spoken to us before, so many of you know her. She has a background from University of Minnesota, a bachelor's degree in ecology and evolution from 2002. And then her graduate work was here at the University of Wisconsin, both masters in land resources and a PhD as well. She's been involved in restoration ecology at the International Crane Foundation. And when I was looking on Zoom information, I saw that she'd been there from 1899 to 2019. I thought that was pretty remarkable, but we've laughed about that. She was really there from, I think, 2007 or so for a few years, and her husband is working there right now on some of the sandhill crane issues that are coming up. So it's a delight to welcome you, Allison. This is a book here that I've been reading and will be reporting on in a couple of weeks. I don't know if you can see it. It's called by Bill Gates, How to Avoid Climate Disaster. And Bill has not only focused on the low-hanging fruit of electricity and transportation, but he's talked about carbon emissions from land and farming. And so that makes us primed for his book because Allison is going to tell us about that aspect of it today and what we might do about it. So I welcome your talk, Allison. The research you're doing is very exciting to me, and I think all of you will feel the same. So you have the floor.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Richard, and thank everyone, all of you who are joining us for this conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all. So today I'm going to talk about a framework for understanding climate impacts and solutions in dairy systems. And as I move through, I really do welcome you to let me know if you need clarification for anything as we're talking. And then I definitely have set aside enough time that we can have a discussion about the concepts as we go forward. So with that, before I begin, of course, I want to make some acknowledgments. And first and foremost is really, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in the USDA Agricultural Research Service. We've been working on a research strategy for achieving greenhouse gas neutral agroecosystems this year. And so this presentation is largely informed by the collective efforts of that team and many people with a depth of expertise in some of these topics. So thank you for their work. So first, I just want to start with a brief overview of what we'll be discussing today. So first, I want to cover very briefly an overview of, go through an overview of U.S. contributions to global greenhouse gas emissions. And then next, go through the greenhouse gas emissions that we have specifically coming from the U.S. agricultural sector with an overview of those sources and an explanation of some terms and processes to help us understand both risks and opportunities. And then next, talk about some of these opportunities for improvement in more depth. And lastly, really bring it all together and talk about how we can think of our agricultural systems as well as our dairy systems in that system context and think about trade-offs and what some opportunities might be for improvement.
Allison, if I may interrupt a moment.
Yeah.
There's moments when you cut in and out, and it might be related to your speakerphone or your headphones. So just check the connections because the volume is going up and down a little bit. Okay.
All right. Let me know if it happens again. Do this slide, and I think what I'll do is I'll unplug my headphones if it's an issue.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm sure many of you are already likely aware of the contributions that the United States is making to global climate change, given the topics of this course. So the US contributes 12.7 to 13.9% to global greenhouse emissions globally. And in this graph, you can see the sources of our US greenhouse gas emissions. The agricultural sector contributes 10% to our total emissions. And this means that agriculture is both significant as well as just one part of a much larger effort that we need to make to curb our emissions across all sectors of our society. So greenhouse gas emissions specifically from the US agricultural sector, there are three gases that are of primary significance. So first we've got nitrous oxide, which represents 58% of US agricultural emissions. Secondly, methane, which represents 41% of US agricultural emissions. And lastly, carbon dioxide, which is 1% of US agricultural emissions. Another way to think about emissions from the agricultural sector is that they arise from three primary sources. So we have ruminant livestock, manure and fertilizer management, and cropland management. If we break these sources down further into their components, we can see that the majority of nitrous oxide coming from US agriculture is from our croplands, while enteric fermentation, so this is the digestion process of ruminant animals, and manure management contribute the greatest part of our US agricultural methane emissions. So enteric fermentation and manure management, of course, are specific to livestock agriculture. However, it's important to remember that our cropland nitrous oxide emissions are relevant to almost all of our agricultural production. So these are management concerns and practices that we need to keep in mind for all agriculture. So I'll talk through each of these sources in a bit more detail so we can think about some opportunities that exist for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from these sources. So first, there's increasing discussion about what it would mean to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality in the US agricultural sector. How would we do this? So first, we might think of a balance sheet of emissions versus carbon storage in looking for pathways where farming emissions are offset or could be offset by carbon storage in our agricultural landscapes. So first, a few terms. The units in this table are million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. These values equate to the percentages that I just displayed earlier for each of the gases from the US agricultural sector.
Allison, we're still having problems with your volume, so maybe you would try it without your headphones, if you would.
All right, can you hear me?
Very clearly, thank you.
Okay, all right, we'll stick with that. We're gonna give up on the technology on that one. All right, so MMT is an abbreviation for million metric tons, and each of these gases is expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents. So the International Panel on Climate Change developed the concept of global warming potential so that greenhouse gases could be compared based on their relative ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is used as the reference gas typically for apples to apples comparisons of various gases. So each gas is compared in terms of its global warming potential, or GWP. This is the ratio of the accumulated radiative forcing caused by emitting 1 kilogram of the gas relative to 1 kilogram of the reference gas for carbon dioxide over a specified time period. So just to put it more simply, it's an estimate of how much energy the emissions of each of these gases will absorb over a given period of time. And often this is over a 100-year time horizon. And this is expressed as a ratio. So because carbon dioxide is the reference gas, its value or its global warming potential over a 100-year time horizon is 1. And then in comparison, methane has a global warming potential that is 25 times greater than carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide has a global warming potential that is 298 times greater than carbon dioxide. If we return to this balance sheet approach, we can see that addressing climate change requires action on both reducing these emissions as well as increasing carbon storage in our agricultural lands. So according to the US Environmental Protection Agency, the agricultural sector emits 628.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And we also have 38 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year stored in our croplands and grasslands. But this storage does not include our US forest carbon storage. And good news, I do see the chat now. So a question here is, what are the implications of continued drought on the possible actions? That's a fantastic question. I will return to this later in the discussion, but I think this really gets at questions of resilience So as we think about our agricultural landscapes and opportunities to mitigate emissions, reduce emissions, we also need to think about what steps are going to allow our producers, our farms to be as resilient as possible to future climate impacts. And so to some extent, we can project for the regions of our country which areas are going to likely experience continued or frequent drought, which areas are likely to experience prolonged or frequent flooding. And we can ask ourselves what types of crops or cropping systems are likely to be most able to withstand these stressors and even to be able to improve conditions. So in our area, flooding, of course, is a greater risk from climate change. And so the question is, are there crops and cropping systems that we can develop that are better able to infiltrate water and really help us to mitigate some of those flooding risks? But we can come back to that as well. All right. There we go. So in this hypothetical example, we can explore scenarios of what it's going to take for us to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality. So just one, example, one path to net zero would be to reduce our agricultural emissions by half and achieve a 10-fold increase in carbon storage in our agricultural landscapes. If we're just looking at the agricultural sector by itself and not thinking about all of the other sectors of society that are emitters, then this would achieve carbon neutrality within agriculture. But it also requires that to pursue that path, cutting emissions in half and increasing storage by 10 times, we would need to identify opportunities for each of these emission sources and evaluate what opportunities we have to increase carbon storage. So I'm going to step through each of these examples, each of these gases, and also the case of carbon storage. So first, very briefly, I'm going to review the nitrogen cycle because it's really important as we think about opportunities to mitigate or reduce nitrous oxide emissions that we think about the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is fixed into ammonia or ammonium, and this can be done through either natural processes, so by microbes or by microbes in a symbiosis with legumes, or by lightning, or by synthetic fixation. And many of you are probably familiar with the Haber-Bosch process is used for synthetic fixation of nitrogen, and it's now the dominant method of nitrogen fixation worldwide. So this is the source of most nitrogen inputs to croplands in the US, is synthetic farm nitrogen inputs. However, the majority of plants and other autotrophs can't use ammonia or ammonium directly, and they require a process called nitrification to convert nitrogen into nitrates, which are the plant usable form. Unfortunately, these nitrates are relatively unstable, so they can be easily lost via leaching out of the system. So when you have a large rain event, if there's excess nitrate that's not being taken up by plants, that can go through the soil profile into groundwater, or it can be washed through the system into our surface waters and cause problems with eutrophication. So loss of nitrogen from the system via leaching or erosion are really significant problems we need to think about. But our focus today is really on how do we reduce the loss of nitrogen from agricultural fields as nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is produced by either the nitrification process or what's called denitrification. So that's the conversion of nitrates to nitrous oxide. And this is really the dominant pathway. Denitrification is the dominant pathway of loss of nitrous oxide from our croplands. So if we think and ask ourselves, what are the conditions that affect this nitrous oxide production? Generally, nitrous oxide emissions are greatest when our soils are wet and we have excess nitrogen fertilizer present. So we have more nitrogen in the soil than the growing crops can use at that time. In Wisconsin, as an example, our wet springs are often coinciding with the timing of nitrogen application, and this has both economic and environmental consequences. And these challenges are really likely to be exacerbated by climate change. So when we see this situation where you have actively growing crops in flooded anaerobic conditions, this is when you can expect to measure higher nitrous oxide fluxes from our fields. Cover crops are one solution that has been identified as effective in both reducing erosion and improving infiltration, but also in reducing nitrous oxide emissions. But there's some evidence that when these cover crops are legumes, and of course, if you think back to the nitrogen cycle, legumes in symbiosis with nitrogen fixing bacteria are able to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into the soil. So when that legume cover crop is terminated, that nitrogen-rich mulch becomes available in the soil, and that can in turn lead to an excess of nitrogen in the soil, which could produce more nitrous oxide. So really, these sorts of cropping decisions need to be informed by the cropping system and what the plant's needs are for nutrients during its growing cycle, the local conditions related to the soil, and things like precipitation and temperature, and just what are the methods that you use to terminate your cover crop, and is it likely to lead to excess nutrients? And then, a further complication is that nitrous oxide emissions are really variable in time and space. Any of you that garden, you probably observed that you might have one area of your garden that's really rich and maybe it doesn't have a lot of rocks or sand, and then you can have another location within your yard that is really rocky or sandy. And so we've got a really heterogeneous soil environment. And of course, that creates enormous research challenges when we're thinking about field scale assessments of how management practices affect nitrous oxide. These fields are very patchy with respect to their soil type, to their moisture and their nutrients. And all these environmental variables are interacting with management practices to produce sort of patchy emissions. And it makes it difficult for us to say, if you implement this emission or this management practice, this is what your emission outcome will be, because that can really depend on where do you happen to have your emissions chambers and did you capture the full range. So many research studies have found that practices which reduce nitrous oxide emissions may also cause nitrogen losses from other pathways in the system, so to nitrate loss or to ammonia loss. And so again, we just really need to think about trade-offs, because we ideally want to find practices and systems that are not just good at mitigating or reducing emissions, but that also are really good at protecting our water quality and creating other benefits that we need for human society. However, despite all this complexity, we do know that there are a few key pathways for reducing nitrous oxide emissions in our croplands. And of course, again, these cropland nitrous oxide emissions represent 95% of all nitrous oxide emissions coming from agriculture. So first, reducing your nitrogen application rate is the most reliable strategy for reducing field nitrogen emissions or nitrous oxide emissions. This has some potential risks for crop yields, because if you pull back your fertilizer applications too far, you might risk not having enough nutrients available for your growing crop. But these costs really need to be weighed against the benefits or the costs of applying too much. Second, targeting your fertilizer applications to the times the crop is in greatest need and is most likely to be able to take up nitrate is really the optimal timing. And so these are best practices that could be more widely adopted. And third, there are nitrification inhibitors. So again, these are preventing nitrate from being converted to nitrous oxide. And these can be effective in reducing that pathway, but they do pose an economic burden for our producers. And lastly, there's some increasing interest in the development of new crops and cropping systems, which require fewer inputs. So they would require less nitrogen to be applied. And this is a key opportunity for reducing emissions. And where these are deep-rooted perennials, we have some real opportunity to increase carbon storage. So now moving on to methane. Methane is our second most significant greenhouse gas from U.S. agriculture. And 70% of our methane emissions are from enteric fermentation. So this is the methane emissions that are a result of the digestion of ruminant animals. And as you can see, 95% of enteric methane emissions are from the burping process that the cattle go through in their digestion. So it's not typically flatulence, which I think is often what people assume. So methane is produced primarily by bacteria that live in soil, water, or the stomachs of ruminant animals. And methane production via enteric fermentation involves three parts: the animal, its rumen microbiome, so what sort of bacteria does it have living inside it, and the feed that you provide. Strategies for cutting enteric methane emissions fall into these three categories. So we have feed management and nutrition, genetics, and management practices. So just to step through each of these individually. So cutting methane emissions via feed management and nutrition involves these three potential pathways. So first, increasing your milk production means that you reduce the emissions. First, increasing milk production coupled with reducing your emissions per unit of milk is a really good strategy. And so this involves potentially formulating diets for groups of cows based on the stage they are in their lactation. This improves their feed efficiency. So animals, as they go through a lactation cycle, whether they have just started in lactation or they're coming to the end, they have very different nutritional needs. And if you can optimize what you're feeding them for what their needs are, they're less likely going to be lost from that process.
Could I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
Allison, it looks like it was not the microphone that you were using. It looks to be a system in the amplification. And so when you lower your voice the least little bit, it looks like the microphone just drops out exponentially, not completely eliminates, but cuts away back. So even you're doing a wonderful job, but just try and keep your voice as even as you can in terms of volume, because knowing that when you let it drop off, it'll drop. Now, I also would like you to touch on the fact that I didn't hear that yet, is that both methane and nitrous oxide do not linger as long in the atmosphere, not nearly as long as CO2. Did you mention that yet?
I have not mentioned that, and that's a really good point. And I think it leads to a lot of challenges in the accounting process for how we think about these gases, especially since methane eventually can be converted to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so there's a lot of discussion and argument about, well, I guess just active discussion about how you should account for, particularly how you should account for methane, because it isn't long-lived in the atmosphere as methane. It does go through that conversion to carbon dioxide. But I think in terms of thinking about what a producer can do at the farm scale, really documenting these emissions and what the greatest sources are and what opportunities might exist for reducing them. At the end of the day, the numbers are too high currently, and so we need to find ways to reduce those emissions, whether it's methane, nitrous oxide, or carbon dioxide. I do think that reducing carbon dioxide is our biggest challenge globally, but I think that other sectors, particularly transportation and energy use, are the places we can have the greatest impacts on carbon dioxide. So I think it's all sort of context, depends on the context and what our real opportunities are for making an impact in a way that is feasible at scale, right? But I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I think it does. Thanks very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So a second path, in this feed management and nutrition approach is to really improve the forage intake and quality. So there's evidence that and when we speak of forages, we're talking about the grasses and the grains and perennials like alfalfa that we're feeding to our animals. Forages are really the grasses and and the biomass that we're feeding to our animals. And the more mature those plants are, there's some evidence that digestibility declines, and that can affect that enteric fermentation process and lead to greater emissions, methane emissions. So really being mindful of what you're feeding and when you're feeding it. And this, of course, involves some complex decisions for the farmer about pasture management or harvest timing. And it requires some information about what are the desired plant species you want on your farm, and what are the sort of the targets for nutritional quality for each of those. And lastly, feed supplements are a growing area of research. Some of you may have heard about increasing interest in seaweed, for example, as a feed additive for dairy cattle. Biochar is another additive that has been explored as a feed ingredient. And in both cases, these supplements, there's some evidence that they act to reduce the methane process. So they interact in the rumen to reduce methane production. So really, this is an area that requires further research to provide producers with options that are safe, effective, and affordable, and won't affect, negatively impact the taste of the milk or other products. Very briefly, just touching on animal genetics, there's some evidence that, or there is evidence that breeds like Jerseys are more efficient in producing milk and in reducing methane emissions. And also selecting for smaller animals within a breed, they have higher milk efficiency and lower methane per unit of milk, and you have a lesser feed burden in terms of how much feed they need to produce that. And lastly, of course, the rumen microbiome is an important area of research. So currently there's an exploration of whether genetic selection of animals based on the rumen microbiome will result in higher efficiency animals, which have a lower methane footprint. And this last pathway for cutting methane emissions from enteric fermentation involves management practices that reduce disease and increase animal longevity. Because once you have a cow in the lactating herd, it's in your interest to have her healthy and to be productive for as long as possible, just to have, for a really good life cycle analysis of that animal's contributions. Also, improving facility and pasture infrastructure and design to increase animal comfort. More comfortable animals are more productive. And this also involves, for example, in pasture, thinking about heat stress and adequate shading for animals, especially in locations where we're likely to experience more extreme heat over time. And then lastly, herd management practices that reduce the age of first calving and calving intervals can lower your greenhouse gas footprint per unit of milk. All right, I'm going to transition here to manure management of methane emissions. So here on the left, I've got a picture of a pretty typical anaerobic lagoon. So this is all of the manure that is coming from the dairy herd is being captured in an open lagoon. And those anaerobic conditions are the conditions which lead most effectively to nitrous oxide production. It also leads to methane production. And as we learned earlier, 24% of methane emissions are from manure management, in addition to 5% of farm nitrous oxide emissions. So a number of practices have been identified for reducing emissions from manure storage. And I welcome you, if you have any questions about any of these. I'm going to cover some of the detail just to give you a spectrum of what's available. So first, we have the opportunity for composting dairy manure. So this is a practice that's accessible to many dairies of varying sizes, although it does require some intentional management for best results. So generally, the process requires a designated composting area, the addition of higher carbon materials such as waste paper or wood chips or straw, and regular turning of the material to ensure optimal temperature and moisture conditions for converting that manure into compost. And again, this is really an aerobic process rather than an anaerobic process. The compost can then be spread on fields or sold to gardeners, and manure managed in this way reduces both methane and nitrous oxide production, as well as farm odors. And that's in comparison to more typical lagoon storage. Secondly, manure separation into liquid and solid components, or applying a manure storage cover to your lagoon. These practices require more capital investment. They're very expensive, and they also, there are some opportunities for federal, state, or local programs available with cost share, but this is typically depends on the circumstances of the farm, or if you're in an area designated as a high priority for addressing water quality or other issues. Manure separators function by removing the solid material from the liquid portion, and the liquid can then be further separated into gray water and higher nutrient liquid manure that is incorporated into fields. So there's some opportunity for recycling and more targeted nutrient management. And then lastly, some of you may have heard about anaerobic digesters, and these are by far the most expensive and difficult to maintain as an individual producer. These are out of reach for most farms. Although they're, in some cases you can have collectives of farms or municipalities working together in managing a digester. So digesters work by converting the methane into electricity. These costs can be offset by selling the electricity or by converting biogas to compressed natural gas to fuel cars and trucks. As of 2020, the US EPA reported that there are 263 anaerobic digesters in the country, on private farms in the US. And then there are more than 1,200 in total operating nationwide. And then just a much simpler practice here at the bottom is really reducing the number of animals contributing to your anaerobic lagoon. So for example, most dairy animals nationwide are managed in confinement systems. Even if they're small dairies, usually the lactating animals are managed in the barn with a very detailed mixed ration that they're fed to optimize milk production. However, all of the younger animals, so we call them, the dairy heifers that are older than calf age, but aren't yet old enough to be in the lactating herd, these animals have lesser nutritional requirements and perform very well on grass. And so the question is, if you have your dairy heifers on pastures from May through September, this is a real opportunity to reduce the loading of manure into your lagoon and instead distribute those nutrients through a well-managed pasture system. So sort of a lower cost, simpler system if you have access to land for grazing. All right, so then moving to just how do you get the material from this process onto the field? Some of the methods used to land spread dairy manure affect both the type and magnitude of field emissions. And in a recent study my colleagues led at the US Dairy Forage Research Center, methods of liquid dairy application were compared to evaluate their trade-offs in both global warming potential as well as nitrogen losses and crop yield. Injection of the liquid manure, and that's the picture you can see there at the bottom. This performed best in lowering field carbon dioxide and ammonia emissions and overall global warming potential, but it had the trade-off of increased nitrous oxide emissions. So when they did the accounting of all emissions, they felt that injection was the best, but for nitrous oxide, it did not perform quite as well. So methane emissions were not affected by a method, whether the manure was land spread or injected into the soil. So this demonstrates some of the challenges that farmers face in attempting to optimize their management for reducing farm emissions. There are trade-offs that are unavoidable in these dynamic, heterogeneous environments, and the best management strategies really need to be targeted to the circumstances of the farm and its local context. All right, so now I'm going to transition to kind of this last section of the balance sheet, which is how we can increase carbon storage. If anyone has any questions thus far about what I've gone through thus far, just let me know. So pathways that we have here are first, really it's thinking about soil stewardship. This is critical. Where possible, we want to minimize our soil disturbance and add continuous living cover. So this means that we reduce or eliminate phases of the year when the soil is bare or without living, dormant, or dead plant material in place to protect it. And many cover crops that are planted within, so intercropped with the primary crop, or planted following harvest of that crop, these can also be harvested and fed to dairy cattle, as you can see in the example here. And secondly, integrating perennials within cropping rotations, as well as adding deep-rooted native perennials within the farm landscape, is an excellent way to store more stable carbon deeper in the soil profile. So this is an example from Iowa State University, which is leading the Prairie Strips program. And this shows some of their efforts to integrate prairie strips planted between crop boundaries or even within the crop along areas where they expect there to be erosion or other challenges due to topography. So two growing areas of interest nationally are agroforestry and silvopasture. So these are perennial-based agricultural systems that involve intentional integration of tree species with tree crops and perennial forages. So agroforestry is typically, it may or may not involve livestock, but again, it's where you're growing a crop in conjunction with growing trees that are either for timber or for tree crops. And then silvopasture is just integrating livestock into that crop forage tree landscape. And because the potential in both of these cases is for greater above ground and below ground carbon storage, these practices are of increasing interest for mitigating climate change. And so the benefit also is that many of these require relatively little capital investment. And so they can be more accessible to newer young farmers if they can find land to start their farm. I'm just going to briefly stop for that. In percentages, how does residential grass, oh gosh, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. So the question is, in percentages, how does residential grass fertilizer nitrogen compared to crop fertilizer in the USA? I have no idea, but that's a great question. I think that I would say just as farmers are looking for opportunities to grow different crops that maybe are a little less nitrogen needy, I think we should also look for ways to grow things in our private properties on our homelands that are maybe a little less resource intensive than lawn, that requires fewer fertilizers. But I'm not sure of what the total footprint would be for nitrogen use for home use. Does anybody else on the call know the answer to that?
I would think it would relate to the area, a residential area versus farming area, and so the farming would have, I would think, a much greater impact. But what the percentages are, I don't know. I'm wondering, in relation to that question, how well you are transmitting, or this what I seem to believe here is fairly new agricultural information to farmers. You know that 50 years ago, the farmers learned about crop rotations and contour plowing, but they're pretty busy with their farms now. And it seems to me you're coming up with a lot of information every year. How do you get this out?
That's a good question. So generally speaking, so I work for the Agricultural Research Service, and often we're thought of as sort of the in-house research agency for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We work in collaboration with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, and really NRCS engages more directly with producers in providing technical support and access to resources. And so in the best scenario, ARS scientists and NRCS technical support professionals are working together, NRCS to inform ARS about what the questions are that farmers have and what their needs are in terms of research. And then ARS sharing with NRCS the results of our work and what our recommendations might be. And then NRCS, really doing their great work to convert that into best practices and recommendations. We also do work very closely with Extension and other scientists that are closer to producers and working with them more directly. That said, I think there's always room for improvement. How can we sort of open our research doors, both at the field stations and other places, and just show some of the work that we're doing and provide a space for people to ask questions and really participate in that research development process, because ultimately it does not matter if we find solutions that aren't practical or are too complicated and aren't going to be adopted. So we need to make sure that we're really, I think, responsive to the needs of our audience. So it's a work in progress, I would say.
You want to give them some motivation. So it's really doubly nice if they not only reduce emissions, but save money in the process. That would motivate them more.
Yeah, or even if we collectively, you know, producers and scientists and technical support together say, this is a pathway that would work if it were affordable. And then that can inform policy and programs that make it possible for some of those things to be adopted. So I think it's that whole sort of environment of it's knowledge, it's practicality, it's economics, it's markets, it's policy. It all needs to be sort of in alignment for us to meet some of these challenges. So
thank you.
Yeah, and so 2 last carbon storage opportunities, and this is one I think that's really exciting, as this like new investment in energy in plant breeding of perennial grains and perennial crops that aren't a replacement, but at least are new alternatives to some of our most common annual crops. And as an example, in this picture, it depicts Kernza, which is the trademarked grain of intermediate wheatgrass. So intermediate wheatgrass has been around for quite a while. It's been used as a forage, but over the last 20 years or so, the Land Institute has really invested in plant breeding to create a grain that can be harvested for human consumption. And this is intermediate wheatgrass after a year. So that September image at the right is its above and below ground biomass at 12 months of growth. And then you can see next to it, you plant winter wheat in the fall. Annual wheat. Annual wheat. It's showing the relative above and below ground root systems of intermediate wheatgrass compared to annual wheat. And this must be in a warmer climate, since they have root growth in December there for annual wheat. But really the question is, can we develop perennial crops that are both capable of providing us with the food we need, as well as providing these really important ecosystem services of below ground carbon storage? And there's some real promise, I think, in this. And so much the better if they're also relatively low input cropping systems that require less nitrogen for persistence. And then we also, of course, you know, here in the upper Midwest, any of you who are interested in ecological restoration of prairie and oak savanna and oak woodland, you know the importance of fire in those landscapes, and that they have evolved over millennia as fire-adapted plant communities. And those fire-adapted plant communities are also really good at storing carbon below ground. So the question is, if we're operating our farms within landscapes where this is, you know, this is the environment, this is the ecological context, is it possible to integrate grazing and fire in a way that we can increase our below ground carbon storage and also generate all these other important ecosystem services through that process? And I add, and biochar question mark. The other question is, if we're removing invasive species like exotic shrubs or trees, can we use that as a feedstock for biochar and then use that biochar as a soil amendment? And these are really questions that we don't have a lot of consistent research to be able to advise that process yet. So it's an area where we can do further study. I have another question here. So to expand on Richard's question, can you advise beyond the national boundaries to the global application needed to counter climate change? To a point, the challenge, of course, is that I'm much less familiar with the pathways of loss of nutrients from the many different places worldwide. I do know that American agriculture, relatively speaking, is much more efficient in converting feed into beef, you know, a pound of beef or a unit of milk. Relatively speaking, our greenhouse gas emissions in American livestock agriculture is much lower than the worldwide emissions. That said, I think it's really important for nations to be able to, with the best available research and technology, be able to develop their own adapted cropping and livestock system that make the most sense for their particular ecological climate, for their markets, for their populations. And that's challenging in that a lot of places around the globe do not have the same resources that we do to invest in research and technology development. And so I think that's something that we need to think about as global citizens, of what our role is as in providing support for development of really climate smart agriculture nationwide. But it is very true that the challenges that we face, although the systems context and thinking about the interactions and trade-offs, I think that applies wherever you operate. I think that the risks and benefits are very different depending on which country you're talking about. And just to end with one very specific example, in the US, we have a real problem with food waste. In other countries that don't have the same transportation networks and refrigeration opportunities and things like that, there's greater risk of food loss happening at the field or in the distribution process. And so for us, we really need to emphasize how can we be more responsible with the resources that go into production of food, and only purchase what we're going to consume, and really do a much better job of not throwing so much of it away. Because when you throw away a package of strawberries, you're not only throwing away the strawberries, you're throwing away all the energy and inputs that went into growing that package of strawberries, and you're throwing away all the energy and inputs that went into creating the package and moving it around. So I think it's very important that we think about that responsibility for us, and then evaluate how what the context might be in a different location. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, Dawn, but it's very complicated, I think, depending on where you are in the world, what the challenges and the opportunities might be. And then I see, I think that was it for those questions. All right, and I'm almost at the point where I'm ready to just do the discussion. So just a couple more slides here for you all. So I just wanted to before we end with the discussion here, I just wanted to lay out this case study of dairy agriculture so we can have a conversation about it. So again, just reviewing our sources of greenhouse gas emissions in dairy specifically. We have enteric fermentation from methane. We have methane coming from enteric fermentation. We have both methane and nitrous oxide coming from our manure management practices. We have nitrous oxide and methane emissions from our croplands. And then of course we have farm energy and fuel use contributing to carbon dioxide. On the other side of the balance sheet, we have carbon storage opportunities. So integration of perennials within the cropping rotation. This might include alfalfa, grass hay, or new perennial forages. We also have managed grazing opportunities, so pasture, and having our animals on grass. And then lastly, stewardship of perennial land cover. So can we not only integrate perennial plants within the crop fields, but also can we integrate perennial crops at our crop boundaries and across the footprint of the farm? Many farms have areas within their farm system that aren't croplands. And so is there a way to have the same active stewardship that we apply to our croplands to the full footprint of the farm boundary, and think of all of these areas as spaces for producing ecosystem services, and what management practices are going to help us produce the broadest array of ecosystem services. So with that, I'm going to end with saying that dairy systems is a case study. Really, its context is everything. So as you think about a particular dairy farm, you need to consider what is its regional climate. So as an example, here in Wisconsin, we get plentiful precipitation. We're really well suited for pasture-based grazing, whether that's your young stock, your heifers that are in your lactating herd, or whether you're a full grass-based dairy. We also need to think about our herd size and type. So how many animals do you have? What breeds do you have? How many in each age class? Do you have much access to capital? Do you have a lot of infrastructure that you need to manage? Or are you relatively low infrastructure, in which case a pasture system is better? What's your land base? What are your soils? What are the risks in terms of the crops that you grow? What is your access to markets? What, for example, if you have a specialty in grass-based dairying, do you have access to markets that'll provide you a premium for that production? And then lastly, what is your farm capacity? And if you do want to transition between management practices or make a significant shift in some of the practices or management opportunities, do you have the resources not only to inform that process, but also do you have the people to really implement that change? So I'm going to end here with a discussion, and I'm going to first start with these questions. So here it says, because methane is 80 times worse than carbon dioxide during the first 20 years, I think that using a 100-year scale for it is, though accurate, not sufficiently alarming, especially with methane volumes from thawing methane hydrates and permafrost rising. I'd like to see that a chart using a 20-year comparison of greenhouse gas emission values. That's a really interesting idea. So I think that there's a lot of discussion and debate about the timelines that should be used for global warming potential. And I think my understanding in some recent discussions I've had is, on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right that having a shorter time scale to really think about the magnitude of the impact of those emissions at the timeline that makes sense is really important. I think it also is important to have, if we're thinking about implementing practices, especially with respect to carbon storage, 100 years is the time scale at which we can begin to understand how those practices will take an effect and help us to draw down carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. However, at the end of the day, I think being clear and transparent about the time scale you're using and why you're using it, and ensuring that it's the best approach for informing management that you think is going to best address the problem. I think these are all, important considerations and show just how complex this is, really. I saw somebody had a hand raised, and I don't know. Was it a Ginny?
I don't see a raised hand. I think you've covered them so far. While we're waiting, could I ask a question?
Of course.
A couple of things relating to the genetics and the selective breeds. You've been focusing on dairy, so this is a little out of your expertise, but I've noticed that there are a few farms in Wisconsin where they breed bison for meat. And I'm wondering, is that, do you think, just a sort of a little niche idea that attracts a few unusual buyers, or do you think that there might be potential for less rumination from bison, perhaps, and better use of soil? What are your thoughts if we were to make more of a transition for beef production now, not dairy, for bison?
You are correct that this is well outside my area. I guess the questions I would have if I were thinking about that as just an exercise and what might the outcomes be, I would wonder, first of all, what is their methane or just general emissions footprint per unit of meat produced, and really do that sort of pound to pound comparison, beef to bison. Just as with beef farming, not all beef farms or ranches are equal in terms of their management practices. I would want to know what is the context in which those bison are being managed. Are they managed in, rotational systems where there's a real ample opportunity for the pasture or the range, however you want to call it, to rebound and to really maintain a healthy below ground rooting structure, because that is really where the benefits of pasture and grass-based agriculture come in, is where you have a management system that allows for healthy plant growth, and especially below ground root growth and storage. And so really it's that interaction between the animal and how it's being managed with the pasture and how it's being cared for. I think that I would make an assumption that bison are probably particularly well suited to native prairie grasses, you would think, since that's historically what would have been available. So the question would be, can they do a better job in foraging on warm season grasses that maybe are very well adapted to potential dry conditions that you would find in the future in some of those rangelands? But then again, they're very big animals. So I don't know, a lot more questions than answers from me on that.
Do you know if they release more methane or less methane? I would think perhaps less.
I honestly don't know, because I don't know what their digestion process is. So yeah, I'm not sure. And I also don't know how much feed they require.
Sure. Okay. And another question that might be a little easier. You mentioned that Jerseys are more efficient milk producers. And I guess the public thinks of them as being more leaning toward milk fat. And perhaps that's why Holstein have been chosen, because people are favor perhaps less milk fat. But from what you implied in your comment, what would happen if we had a major shift to Jersey cows? Would that reduce some of the emissions that we get if they're more efficient at making milk?
I would say that if you asked somebody who's more familiar with the breeds and their care, my understanding from the outside looking in is that people, there are very strong cultural relationships with cattle breeds. And I'm sure it's based in real experiences, but there is an affinity, and there's a reason that Holsteins are the dominant breed. I think that there's growing interest in Jerseys and some other breeds because they do require less feed. They're smaller animals, and there is some evidence that they produce fewer emissions per unit milk. And because they have higher milk fat in their milk, you actually do get paid more for the quantity of milk produced, because that's how the payment is made, is based on milk fat. However, Holsteins are greater in producing volume, right? So it just depends on sort of your business model and how you make ends meet. And the other thing to keep in mind is many confinement dairies, their whole system, their infrastructure is sized to a breed of animal. The size of the stalls, the size of the milking equipment, everything is based on what the likely animal is that's coming through that system. So even if a producer were convinced that Jerseys might be more effective from a climate standpoint, and again, there's a lot of factors that go into that, it might not be feasible for them to make that shift. So I think there's growing interest, but I think it's definitely not a simple process of shifting from one breed to another.
Okay.
And I can see some questions here.
Yeah, we have some new ones. Do you want to read them off and answer them yourself on the chat?
Yeah, so I will, okay, so I'm going to start from the top. So I see Mary Jane do these mega farms have any laws or practices that control all the emissions they produce? Would not it be better to have incentives to help small farms continue instead of having the industry taken over by huge farms? So I think that, for me as an ecologist working in agricultural research, my focus needs to be on outcomes. It needs to be on what are the practices that are most likely to lead us to improved water quality, improved climate mitigation opportunities. Farm size may or may not come into it. It really depends on the practices that are implemented by a large farm or a small farm. I think it's important that farms of any size have research that is available to them and informing their decision making so that they can make the best choices for the particular context of their operation. The question of emissions and regulatory context for emissions, I mean, you could look to California because I think that is the state that is most directly addressing emissions from the agricultural sector and see what the consequences are for that. Unfortunately, because emissions are really on a per animal basis, that regulatory context is as likely to affect small farms as it is large farms. And the question is, can we provide solutions that help producers adapt fast enough so that they can be both economically and environmentally successful? And really, we want to make sure that all farms have an opportunity to continue to be resilient and productive. So I'm not sure if that directly answers the question, but I do think incentives are important. And I think that regulations where they occur, it really must be regionally adapted because sometimes, well, as we've discussed in some of these slides, the outcomes are so variable depending on local conditions. So really we need to make sure that we have sufficient information to have really good policy so that we don't have just unintended consequences from some of those policies. And then I see here, it says the disappearance of small farms implies economic implications are increasingly important. Isn't this a disincentive for some of your recommendations? Absolutely, it's a huge disincentive. I think that it's not just the economic strain, it's also the emotional and just the sheer exhaustion of having to operate in an economic environment that feels really insurmountable. And this is the hardest part, right? Is we can develop very good models and very good recommendations for practices that will address these environmental challenges that we've found. But those solutions are only going to be adopted if people have the capacity and the resources available to make that work. And even though some of these practices actually are lower in input costs and in the long term would probably be more financially advantageous, that transition phase when you're adopting a new practice or you're even shifting between types of farming systems, that's really challenging. And it's a time when people need a lot of support. So I think it's, a question of what do we value and do we reward producers sufficiently when they adopt practices that we want to see, and does that food distribution process, does it allow for the farmer to keep enough of the profit to really be able to continue incorporating these improvements in the system? And these are challenging questions. And as a follower, should there be more regulation and subsidies to enable these changes? I think that's a question that would be best asked to a roundtable of producers and dairy processors and people working, on the front lines of the regulation or process, whether you're state agencies or national agencies that are struggling, even local municipalities struggling with some of the outcomes. This is a system, and it means that wherever you direct a change toward one piece of it, they're going to be trade-offs. And so I think bringing people together to talk about, again, the outcomes that you want to see. And I think most of us, whether we're farmers or whether we're closely tied to agriculture through research or just as consumers of food, most of us want a stable climate. I hope all of us want a stable climate. I hope all of us want clean water. I hope all of us want healthy food systems, and food systems that are economically just to the people producing the food. So if that's the case, if we share those goals, we should be willing to start to investigate what's it going to take to make that possible at the farm level. But that's more than I can answer, unfortunately. That's a big challenging question. And then I see this question here: rabbit gut microbes can enhance cellulosic breakdown to biofuels. Can these microbes enhance cow fermentation? Oh, I have colleagues who would be thrilled to probably answer this question. I know that there is clear evidence that the microbial community varies from animal to animal, and there are high efficiency animals in terms of their ability to convert feed into milk with relatively fewer emissions, and there are low efficiency animals, and there is a significant difference in their microbial community. So whether or not you could have cross species, knowledge in what microbes would be best suited for reducing the methane production process in enteric fermentation, I do not know. It's a really good question, but I think those sorts of creative, outside of the box questions are pretty critical for us solving these very big questions of how do we stabilize our climate system so we can continue to live here, right?
I have a question. I'm enjoying reading and listening to these as you are, Allison. I'm wondering about the future of milk. Do you think it's going to take off, that they're starting to make more and more dairy-free milk from various kinds? At first, they tried almonds, and then they realized so much water gets used in growing almond trees in California that wasn't so popular, and it didn't taste all that great. And so we tried various other origins of milk. I don't think we've found very good substitutes yet, but as you look at substitutes, do you think there is much motivation, or do you feel that to change to plant-based milks, or do you think that dairies have a long history ahead of them, even with these prevailing winds of negativism that are starting to arise? But what's the future of the dairy?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think ultimately, as I think about, just day-to-day decisions about what to eat and what not to eat, it always comes down to the system, right? It's life cycle analysis of energy use, of water use, of where is it produced, and also thinking about not just the environmental context, but also the economic and social justice context. Are the people producing the food adequately compensated for the work that they're doing? I think there's a role for dairy in the long term. I think there's enough opportunity to really have healthy, sustainable dairies. And I think it is unique nutritionally from plant-based, protein drinks that, it is distinct, and it is also relatively efficient to produce. And so the question is, can we continue to produce this high value product while also ensuring good stewardship of our land and water resources? And is there a win-win scenario where having animals on the land is a good way to also ensure our soils, our best soil outcomes, because there is a real benefit in having access to animal-based manures compared to synthetic fertilizers. There's some real soil health benefits there. So the question is, how do we get the best from that system? These win-win, good for the environment, good for people. And that, again, it all comes down to, I think, the context of the farm and the management practices.
Thank you for that. I'm also wondering about nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas. I always thought as a physician of nitrous oxide as laughing gas. Sort of we used it as an anesthetic during obstetric delivery sometimes. And I never thought of it as a greenhouse gas. We associate farming with release of CO2 and methane, but this nitrous oxide is relatively new to me. Is it to everyone? How new is this research that you're doing? Is it just a few years old, or does this go back?
So, yeah, so I don't do much nitrous oxide research. Primarily, I'm focused on soil respiration, so carbon dioxide emissions. But yeah, nitrous oxide is a much more significant issue in agriculture than carbon dioxide. And so we have scientists both within the Agricultural Research Service as well as within universities worldwide that have spent their life working on nitrous oxide. And I think the challenge is that it is so difficult and time intensive to measure effectively. It requires, I mean, thinking back to what we discussed about the conditions that affect nitrous oxide, it's after a wetting or a precipitation event, and that nitrous oxide, those fluxes occur for weeks after that precipitation event. So that means you either need automated systems deployed in the field at multiple locations to capture that variability over weeks, or you need human beings lugging out equipment, capturing that. And so there's new questions about, are there automated systems that we could put out in fields to better get at that variability? Could we, capture that from planes or from ultralights? How can we better document how a management practice affects these emissions? And not only that, but how that management practice affects ammonia emissions and other sources of nitrogen loss from the system. Because ultimately the goal is to conserve nitrogen so that it is captured in the plant rather than applying it and then having it lost. So it's a growing field. Yeah.
So the nitrous oxide release would apply not only to wetted dairy lands that are allowed to dry, but what about wetlands if they're allowed to dry? Would that not also apply there?
Well, so wetlands are a source of nitrous oxide, a natural source of nitrous oxide. And one of the challenges with nutrient loss from agricultural lands is not only might you have volatilization of ammonia or nitrous oxide emissions from the field, but if soil or nitrates are lost and move into a wetland system, there all of a sudden the wetland has more nitrogen than it would naturally have. Yeah. And so even though you're not measuring it at the field, it's really that field is the source of nitrous oxide emissions in the wetland. And then of course there is natural nitrous oxide flux coming from wetlands to begin with. So yeah, it's very complicated, and it requires far more instrumentation than we have and people that we have to measure it. But I think it's a really interesting set of questions about, how can we be more efficient and effective with the nutrients we apply.
Well, thank you. I recall very much we had a speaker last February, late February, Meredith Engwin. You may not have heard of her, but she is a grid expert. And her theme throughout her talk was, it's complicated. The whole idea of auctioning off various forms of electricity at so many second intervals really makes the understanding of the grid extremely complicated. And I think what you've just done here, it is a bit depressing. What can we do for a subject as complicated as this? How can we manage it? And we have to understand it first. And it's very complicated. But you've opened up my eyes to a lot, and I'm sure the whole group of us here today. And we thank you very much. We will continue to look to your facility and its research findings and what it's doing for us with great respect. And so we feel that you're not only helping us, but you're helping us to understand, but you're helping the organization where you work to get its message across. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much. This has been a lot of fun.
Any other thoughts, questions out there? Last chance. It's 20 after 11. We're not rushed, but we do have time for any last minute thoughts, questions from anyone. Don't see anything here. Any raised hands? Okay, well, on that, I will just thank you again, Allison Duff, for your very good discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you again sometime in the future. Let us know when you or some of your colleagues would like to express themselves to our group, and we appreciate it very much.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you all. And like I said, I really appreciate the opportunity for the discussion. A lot of fun.
This will be recorded and is being recorded, and we look for it in a few days on the PLATOMadison.org website. Just look for recorded sessions. Thanks again, Allison. Bye-bye now, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.